Hi, I'm Othais, and this is a special episode that has frankly been long overdue. I apologize for interrupting our regularly scheduled deep dives into various individual small arms designs, but in the years that we've been producing this show, I've run into one concerning problem over and over again. There doesn't seem to be a single unified way of talking about how revolvers work. Some of you might know that I have become something of a revolver obsessive and have amassed a collection of both patents and physical examples in order to unpack this blind spot in small arms history. I assure you I did not have any particular love for the wheel gun when I started down this path. However, it became a necessity due to the sheer confusion I had in trying to create a consistent product for all of you to enjoy. When we talk about, say, bolt-action rifles or semi-automatic pistols, basically any martial firearm except a revolver, we have the advantage of drawing from an existing and well-understood lexicon that almost everyone is engaged in using. Yes, generally, most people know what a trigger is or a hammer, but we also have clear terms for mainspring versus the recoil spring, or indirect bits like the disconnector or an out-of-battery safety. Religious fervor is dedicated to the magazine, and we all know what the follower is. And of course, we have names for various types of locking systems, assuming it is a locked breech. Those various systems are compared, analyzed for their best and worst properties. Their inventors are regularly acknowledged. For rifles, we debate front locking versus rear locking, cock on close or open, various gas or recoil systems, all in fine detail with a firm vocabulary. But for revolvers, well, we know that they rotate and that there are single actions or double actions. Honestly, most of the known revolver terminology exists to differentiate them from other firearms, but not from each other. Excepting, of course, whether it's for cowboys or detectives. Now, obviously, this has not been a major problem for most people, but it became a huge obstacle for myself. Since we have a show that covers every firearm we can, including service revolvers in detail, I'm forced to both unearth the origins of various designs and also to describe each of their components so that you, the viewer, can easily differentiate one from another. Small problem, I could never find any consistency, not in terms nor in credit for various features. While I've read numerous books on a plethora of revolvers, each has basically used its own lexicon, or more often, avoided getting into too much detail on those mechanisms. Terms differed wildly from author to author depending on the firearm covered. They also frequently credited various features to the nearest precursor design, not the original inventor, who, under investigation, likely solved the problem more than a decade earlier than mentioned. Now, are all of these authors lazy? Are they stupid? No, I don't think so, not even a little bit. Instead, I suspect that they are all suffering from a narrow perspective. I've been doing a lot of patent research and digging into the parts lists of various manufacturers. And frankly, I've realized something. There has never been much in the way of consistency. Every inventor, every manufacturer has described their parts in their own way. Yes, borrowing from engineering terms, but often making different choices, forever muddying the waters between each system. Even in the US commercial market, Smith & Wesson and Colt have never actually settled on what to call each individual part despite their being nearly identical in function, and regularly form. That might be well and good if you're restricting yourself to talking about just one product family. But I can't accept that. I have to discuss these systems, and after years of grasping at various names for the same general part, I'm sick of it. I've noticed that I am not consistent between episodes. So I took some time, sat down with all of my patents and part lists, applied some common sense, and came up with my suggestion of a universal revolver dictionary. This matter has sadly been stalled repeatedly because of our need to produce a show every other week, a long, detailed show. So for today's episode, I've purposely set aside our usual research and production time to just focus on finally answering this question for myself. Going forward, these are the terms that this show will be using in an attempt to make these systems more readily comparable and more easily understood to you, the viewer. Since some of these are not in common use today, I'm going to explain the core of our new lexicon. This little dictionary won't cover every part in every revolver ever made, but I have considered it enough to be effective for all the revolvers that we've seen in the show so far. So let's go ahead and cover the basics. Reviewing the obvious, we have a single, as in manually cocked and then fired revolver, or double, as in pull the trigger and it does all the work for you, action revolver, single action, double action. This is built on a frame that houses the lock work and in most cases the cylinder. In this case, it's a solid frame because it wraps all the way around that cylinder. You might have, say, an open top revolver or a top break revolver. This one, though, is a solid frame. If we look to the rear, the area where we grasp the revolver is called the grip. That's basically all of this. In the US specifically, there's a habit to call these guys the grips, these pieces of wood on either side. But I actually like what the British usually used to do, which is calling it either the stock if it was one piece, or stock plates if it's two pieces. So in other words, you would have two stock plates on your grip, which lets us talk about the whole thing a little bit easier. This particular revolver happens to have a side plate, meaning a section of the frame that can be removed in order to see down into the lockwork without having to fish everything out and assemble it sort of blindly. Not every revolver has this. This one does. Now, most 99% of revolvers are hammer actuated, the hammer being the percussion element here. Let me cock that back single action style and you'll see the whole thing in all its glory. In this case, we have a firing pin attached to the hammer to reach a center fire primer. That is not how every ignition system works, but that's how this one does. You might also see a firing pin set in the frame or a complete lack of firing pin if it's a percussion system. Now, the hammer is released by the trigger. So we would pull trigger, gun go boom. I don't think anybody's surprised by that terminology. Sometimes the trigger is acting directly on the hammer, but in this case, we do have a separate and independent sear. That's this little tipping block here. If I cock the hammer back again, we'll see it. Holding the hammer back right there, pressed up against the trigger here. If we tip it with the trigger, it of course releases the hammer to fall. That is exactly what you would expect. Now, at the back of all this, the thing that's constantly pushing the hammer forward is called the mainspring. There's a number of other flattened V-springs in this gun. Each one is assigned to its component. For whatever reason, mainspring usually involves the spring that is operating directly on the hammer and may do other functions. Other springs are generally named for the part that they're interacting with at the moment. I'm not really sure why we've never gone for just hammer spring when we say sear and trigger spring, but mainspring is the term that we traditionally use and people are very comfortable with. Zooming in a bit, many revolvers have a little sort of tab that is connecting the mainspring to the hammer. This allows it to operate more smoothly whenever it's delivering that power, when it's being cocked and unloaded. This guy is called the stirrup. All right, thus far, everything I've mentioned is, for the most part, universally recognized in English, most commonly because these components are common to many firearms, not just revolvers. But there are some particulars that we need to lock down. Working with our Webley Kaufman, a British design, we'll be able to more easily see some of what I'm talking about just because of the nature of the top break action. We have a cylinder here, that's what revolves and actually is indexed into place in order to align each chamber one by one with the barrel. So chambers inside of the cylinder. At the back of the cylinder is usually a set of teeth that are known to collectively as the ratchet. The reason it is a ratchet is because this is designed so that it can be pushed in one direction, and then the pushing element, which we'll see in a moment, slips back down and then catches the next tooth by popping over. That particular guy is on the other side of the gun here and is called the hand. You can see it rise and try to press on out into where the ratchet would be every time I pull the trigger or operate the hammer. Now, that hand has been sort of controversial for a long time. Previous manufacturers, especially in the US, tended to argue between calling it a hand or a pawl, although hand seems to have won out in the end. I like it because it's a very unique term that applies to this particular pawl, because many things in a revolver could be a pawl. Now, while we have her open, this particular gun is great for showing you two things. Let me just check that focus. Looking right here, you'll see a little guy that moves with the trigger because it's actually attached to it. That's our cylinder stop. In front of it is our cylinder locking bolt, which is spring-loaded to work with pressure from the hammer in this particular design, but not always. These two both do similar, but not quite the same thing. Looking at this cylinder from the side, we have a set of scallops that are the stops on the cylinder, and then we have some notches that are the locking bolt notches at the front of those stops. Now, both are important for the operation of this particular handgun. The stops are actually what allows this guy to index each time. So as we fire the gun, You can actually see that little nubbin rising. It's going to catch that next scallop. That's going to halt the rotation of the cylinder in this direction. The hand is pushing the other way as well, so therefore it is now stuck between the hand and the stop, and it's therefore aligned, and boom, it's going to go off with the chamber aligned with the barrel. In the case of this particular firearm, you may see that little tab right there. It's real small, but currently it is locking the cylinder inside of the little notch that was available to it. Now watch that little guy, because he's going to drop out of our way in order to allow rotation, and then at the moment of fire, he's going to come right on back up because of tension from the hammer. Now that means it's not always terrific to have a bolt hold it for alignment, but what it is doing is that when we let go of the trigger and that hand drops on back down those ratchet teeth, we're not going to get any counter rotation. And if we have it in our holster and we bump up against something, we're not going to get any rotation, setting us out of order on our rounds. This is preventing rotation basically every time, except at that really critical moment right before fire. Only in this gun, though. There are guns that do not have locking bolts that just use the stop in order to time themselves, and there are guns that do not have stops and just have locking bolts in order to time themselves. This one just happens to have both, and that works out for a little segment right now. With our cylinder removed, I can show you this guy. Actually, he should be held still, and the cylinder rotates on him. The central pin on which a cylinder rotates has been known by a number of names. Actually, pin was a very common one, but it requires sort of conjoining a bunch of words to understand which pin you're talking about. I actually like the term arbor to refer to the pin on which the cylinder spins in a revolver. Arbor. All right, that's the easy stuff. Let's get into something that has been nagging at me for quite a while. In double action revolvers, there's generally some sort of connection between the trigger and the hammer, and it's a separate piece, usually on a hinge. In the case of this French Chamelot Delvine, we can see him right there. It's that little hand puppet looking guy. If I pull the trigger, we'll see our little hand puppet looking guy is actually pushing up that hammer in that notch until it slips on by and it goes bang. That's our double action. The little hand puppet in this case also helps on single action because it drags that trigger along with. The reason trigger has to come along with is so that the hand will operate because it is worked off the trigger. That is not always the case, by the way. Some revolvers have the hand attached directly to the hammer. Now, again, if we're relying on the sear, so this little guy's actually technically not doing anything at the moment. And then when the sear tips, that guy goes ahead and gets out of the way and it drops. This piece has been known by a number of names over the years, but I think it's time to lock it in. Before we do, though, I want to point out it doesn't have to be attached to the trigger. Looking at this Danish military revolver, which uses the Fonyu system, we can see that we have a spring-loaded bar attached to the hammer. If we pull the trigger, it's going to push up on the bar itself, although it's hard to see underneath that hand, until it slips past that bar, dropping the hammer. And then if we release, it's going to nudge right on past it, and then its little internal V-spring is going to pop it back out. Now, this guy actually has a name already, commonly in the US. It's called a hammer nose. Now, that is very specific to this configuration, and of course, this is not the only way to do it. We've just seen that this is the second way to do it just tonight. And you know what? I'll show you a third that's really weird. This one's going to be a little hard to see, so watch the birdie. As I pull our trigger, it starts to emerge. Right there, down in there. See it dragging the hammer along? Oh, it's going to hook back under. Drag, drag, drag. And then boom. That is easily one of the strangest linkages I have ever seen. It's a dragging bar that transfers energy from the trigger to the hammer. I have struggled to find an appropriate name for this component. It seems every inventor and every company had their own opinions on the matter. Most commonly today, we tend to see it in the form of a hammer nose, but that is a specific configuration of this particular part. What we need is a universal term. Now, I've seen it called a pawl, a sear, a secondary sear, a transfer bar, and other things. But my favorite term, at least in form of utility, is the word dog. The earliest instance I can find for this use of the term actually comes from an Ethan Allen pepperbox patent from 1854. While it isn't perfect, it does overlap some with earlier sidelock firearms terminology. Honestly, any other engineering term you apply to this dog could also be applied to the hand, or potentially more parts in a complex revolver. We simply must make a choice, and while I've debated just naming it perhaps the foot, it doesn't have any history to it and somewhat confuses the relationship. So I'm going to stick with dog going forward. With that locked in, let's keep digging. Using this Colt 1878, we can talk about counter rotation a bit more. So if I fire 1, 2, 3 rounds out of this gun, when I go to fire the fourth especially, we're going to be really off weight. We're going to have weight on the left side of the cylinder from loaded rounds and a lot of empty cases on the right. Whenever we release that trigger from that fourth round, let's say, when we release it, it's going to drag the hand back down the ratchet teeth, and it's going to, oh, look at that. We're revolving the wrong way. And if you get enough of that, you might end up feeding that same empty casing over and over again. Now, some of the earliest guns that faced this problem solved it by just having a little friction spring press on the face of the cylinder, or maybe even putting a friction spring inside the central arbor that holds the cylinder. But there's other mechanical ways to achieve a solution. The Colt 1878 eventually made use of the loading gate and its spring tension to keep the gun from counter-rotating. They put a little tooth on the gate that's able to reach the ratchet teeth of the revolver. If we look at it from behind, you'll see the gate get pushed out of the way as the gun is indexed. And then it snaps back in. It's very faint, but watch that again. Push out, snap in. Push out, snap in. Each time it snaps in, it tooths in order to prevent counter rotation. So when I showed you that earlier, I had left the gate open where you couldn't see it. With it closed, there is no counter rotation. Any device that prevents counter rotation in my book is called a sprag, which is a term that was thankfully given to me by one of our patrons. I actually rather like it for this use. It limits rotation in one direction, but not the other. Sprag, that's your vocabulary word. While we have this Colt 1878 out, it can help me explain some other functionality and terms that are kind of important to know, especially because it's fairly uniquely done on the Colt series of centerfire revolvers. In this position, the hammer's all the way down. The firing pin would have been on a primer if this gun were loaded. This is the fired state. If we manually rebound, we end up in a rested position with the firing pin retracted. That is the rebounded hammer. In this case, it was a manually rebounded hammer because I did it myself. In European revolvers, this is the safety position, and it's the position in which you would load and unload the gun. In the Colt, however, the cylinder is actually locked, almost like having a locking bolt, so this is how you would carry it, with the hammer rebounded slightly where the firing pin can't reach the primer, and therefore the cylinder doesn't rotate as well. This works out well in Colt system, it's just not what other people did. They went one step further and frankly have caused a lot of confusion for other people along the line because they have a half-cock position. This is positioned halfway back to cocking. That was very common to a lot of firearms for the safe position of being able to load or unload the firearm and then return it to normal fire by either going to full cock or easing the hammer down manually. This would be equivalent to a rebound in a European revolver. You could have the rebound and the half cock be the same position and the same functionality. This gun, however, has both a rebound and a half cock, and only in the rebounded position does the cylinder rotate on these old big bore Colts, which is just a little bit interesting. If somebody calls a rebound a half cock or a half cock a rebound, it's probably not the worst thing in the world because they are so similar in function. On many revolvers, like this number 4 Webley, the rebounding system can be automatic instead of manual. So if I fire this, it's going to go over center under inertia, go boom, and then it actually springs back on its own instantaneously to the rebounded position. Now, auto rebounders are not always instantaneous. Just look again at our Fanyu. If I were to pull that trigger and let it fire, the hammer stays down until I release the trigger. That's actually happening because of that little bar right there, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. In our Webley number 4, the immediate rebound is achieved by the lower mainspring arm simply bouncing the hammer back. In the Spanish Ona, releasing the trigger pivots a lever, a lobe on which rebounds the hammer. Rebounds also regularly serve as a hammer block, another term for our dictionary. An example of a dedicated hammer block can be found on this Austrian Gasser 1870. It's actually this bar right here that has a couple of tabs that project into the frame and interact with the trigger and the hammer itself, although on a tail that you can't really see on the other side of it. So if we were to pull this trigger, and fire the revolver, boom, she goes forward. And then if we release, well, nothing's happening. If we look carefully, we can see there's some flex on that spring though. If I rebound the hammer manually, that spring snaps in, and a cross pin has now blocked the movement of the hammer. Not just a notch, not just a sear, but an actual block, a piece of cross metal that keeps us from being able to bang this down with force. Like say, if you were to drop it directly on the hammer. This positively keeps the hammer and its firing pin from reaching the primer of the cartridge, or maybe a percussion cap if that's the area you're in. This is a safety system. Now, of course, it's possible to have an internal hammer block, like on this Bodeo. It's actually this piece attached to the back of that hand. If we cock around back, you'll see him stick up in the wind. He has a little right angle to him that sticks off to the side in front of the hammer. If it does not meet this notch that you see it so comfortably fitting in, then the firing pin can never reach the primer. That means the trigger has to be back in order for the hammer to go forward. If we let her on down, you can see that if we were to whack this hammer on the ground accidentally, that little piece of metal that's wrapped around the front of its stem would mean it can't actually make contact with the primer unless the trigger moves it out of its way. That's a very safe system. I want to point out, by the way, while we're looking at these are both automatic hammer blocks. I don't have a strictly manual hammer block to show you, but they do exist, especially in early percussion revolvers like the Adams. You would see a sort of flex spring that you would ease the hammer down onto it while pressing it in. They would tooth together, and the next time you cock the action, the hammer block would spring positively out of the way. Now, rewinding back to hammer rebounds, most that we've encountered also serve as hammer blocks. In the Smith & Wesson K-frame, we have a sliding rebound block with its own internal coil spring. It's constantly pressed forward, and it has a nubbin at the top that interacts with a nubbin off the hammer to push it back after firing. So if we fire the gun, see how the nubbins interact when I release the trigger. It also scoots under the nubbin so that we have the horizontal surfaces touching right there, which means that if you try to bash this guy forward, it tries to compress down on that guy and therefore acts as a hammer block. Now, unfortunately, this was not strong enough in the long run, and so an additional hammer block had to be added to these guys. In this case, it's actually a spring out that is cammed to work off the hand. The hand would cause this guy to bounce in and out of the way of the hammer further up in this section. Bit hard to visualize, but you get the idea. This gun technically has two hammer blocks, a combination rebound block and a sort of side spring pressure block. Many K-frames later ended up with the block just like the one we saw in the Bodeo, with an arm that comes up and meets a notch in the hammer. So even this was not acceptable enough if you dropped it far enough and fast enough. The most common hammer rebound / blocking system that we've encountered on our show so far comes from the Fonyu patent of 1874. This part actually evolved from an earlier concept, currently best credited to Hubert Comblain, though that might change as we learn more in the future. This guy right here, this arm on a peg, which actually we have seen in other forms just as a component of the mainspring, but this arm that wraps around everything else to make contact with the hand and apply transfer pressure into the hand and the trigger is also a rebound on the hammer like we saw earlier. If we fire the gun, boom, when we release, we're going to press right here on that hammer. It's going to kick it out of the way. It's technically a hammer block in the sense that if I try to push forward on that hammer, it tries to compress down the length of this guy towards that pin and therefore cannot allow the hammer to go forward into a primer. However, that little bit, the rebounding and block, evolved from a pre-existing arm like this that did that wrap-around communication of force from the lower mainspring to the hand, to the trigger, and therefore saved on having to put a lot of other springs in the gun. This arm is so common that I've actually need to give it a name, and I've opted to call it just the transfer arm because it's such a natural word to say, and because the primary thing we recognize about it is the ability to get around everything else and put pressure into the hand. So arm and hand. That's at least what I'm going to go with for now. Generally, it's such a unique part. You may see transfer bars of this type throughout a revolver that we don't need to name every one, but because the Fonyu system is so widespread today, I think it warranted its own term. And with all that, we've defined most of the core lockwork features of a revolver. Now, of course, there will be exceptions that require their own terminology. A good example of this would be like a grooved indexing revolver. We can see an example in Colt's 1853 patent. Here, grooves have been cut in the cylinder instead of using a hand and ratchet system. I happen to have a groove and pin right here, so we can take a quick look at what I mean. This is a Webley Fosbury, a semi-automatic revolver in the sense that when we fire the gun, it recoils back, indexes the cylinder, and then returns forward. So see that cylinder rotation? See if I can do that slower. See how it's moving along those grooves? That's all thanks to a barely visible pin that thankfully we'll see if I open this action up. Right there, that sort of diamond-shaped stud is what's acting as our pin, and all it has to do is stay perfectly still while these grooves pass back and forth over top. As the cylinder moves back and forth, it slams these little diagonal cuts into the edges of that pin and therefore forces the cylinder to rotate and then drop into the next track. There, it holds the cylinder in alignment with the bore so that we can set the gun off for the next round. It's actually kind of curious to think about the fact that what we really do have, in a sense, is a fixed locking bolt that never disengages, and we just have very complicated locking bolt notches. Probably not the best way to describe it, so I'm fine with the groove and pin system. Returning all the way back to the concept of single and double action, a strange muddying of the two can also be found in some revolvers. This American percussion revolver by Savage is actually a single action only, despite how complex it may seem. I can cock the hammer manually, and then boom, I can set off the hammer. If I pull the trigger, yeah, there's no double action there. And yet, I could do something like this, and then pull the trigger. That is still not double action. As a matter of fact, that's just a cocking lever. It is a lever that transfers force to the hammer so that I can cock it single action from a different irregular position, therefore making it, again, just a regular single action. This British tranter confuses the matter even more because our trigger is attached directly to our cocking lever. So I can pull that lever back and then pull the trigger in order to release. Technically a single action because pulling the trigger again does nothing. And yet, it's not really what you expect because we're not manually cocking the hammer back on our own right now. I can't even get a grip on it. We have to cock it this way. And if we release, we actually don't have any sear connection. See? We do have a hammer block though. See that guy working there automatically? Look at him go. Since we don't have a sear connection, it really baffles people to explain this as a single action because we're clearly cocking and then firing. And if we pull both of these, it's effectively an emulated double action because it'll just go off if I pull both at the same time. But no, we've just sort of split the function of double action trigger into two components, a cocking lever and a trigger. This little American Arms 38 pocket revolver is going to really muddy the waters though, because if I switch this little switch to the rear, it is a double action revolver. We'll pull the trigger and we'll hear the snap of the firing pin. But in its current position, it's what's known as a hesitation lock, in which the trigger also serves as a cocking lever. You can actually have a trigger that is a cocking lever and yet is not double action. Let me show you what I mean. If we pull this back once and hold it all the way to the rear, you're not hearing any snap. You guys don't hear anything, right? I'm squeezing real hard. If I let go and then pull again, single action. So I can cocking lever with the trigger, and then pull trigger, single action, fire this. That is a hesitation lock. Cock, release, fire. That really makes me uncomfortable with even trying to name things anymore. Again, there is always more to discover, but I think this covers the worst of it in regards to lock work. That just leaves us with loading and unloading the revolvers. For a muzzle loading revolver like this one, we have to put our powder and ball up front and then compress it with our loading lever. Now these terms are not exclusive to revolvers, nor is the fact that this uses a percussion cap set on either a firing cone or what people generally call a nipple. This is sort of like an inverted firing pin. That's the pointy hard surface with a hole drilled through it to allow the flash to get to the powder. Our hammer, of course, doesn't have a firing pin. It just has an extension that would smack down in between that cone and itself in order to crush the percussion cap. Using our Portuguese abity, we can see maybe the ultimate evolution of a loading gate revolver. The loading gate being the term for, well, this guy right here, the thing that keeps the cartridges in the revolver and allows you to feed them in, and in this case also kick them out. In order to kick them out, we'll actually use this ejector rod. Now, not every revolver uses an ejector rod, but many of the older ones do. So we would align with our cylinder, punch out from the chamber, that would clear our spent casing. All right, ejector rod out of the way. We can also point out that I did a cool trick called the abity system, in which the hammer is disconnected from the trigger so that we can index the cylinder without actually firing this revolver. That allows us to rapidly load or unload a gate loading revolver. Since it was developed by abity, we're just going to call that an abity system. It can be accomplished with a number of different methods, although the most common in actual production is the one that's in this particular example. It's a sort of rolling hammer block that doesn't block up any other parts of the action. I have, however, seen, especially in patents, other ways of doing this. Now, our Colt New Army here is a swing-out cylinder loading system. So the entire cylinder swings out to the side, and therefore we can place in our rounds. We can also choose to eject them at this time by pressing on this rod. This rod is generally called the extractor or ejector rod. This guy at the back that's actually pulling the casings from the action is called the extractor, or in some cases, the ejector. I'm not sure why, but it feels more comfortable to call this an extractor and yet call this the ejector rod. Weird. I think in order to be consistent though, it should be the extractor and the extractor rod. Now, I'm operating it manually. That is not always the case. Some systems have automatic extractor rods. While we're talking about swing outs, I also want to point out that this subassembly here that is holding on to our arbor and cylinder and rotates away from the frame is called the crane. Our Webley number 4 is an auto extractor. So as I open it, it engages the extractor automatically, pressing it from the cylinder and then snapping it back into position. There is an extractor rod in there. It's just that we don't use it. It's a mechanical function of another device. The extractor rod is pressed on by a sort of lever, which I've taken to calling the lifter, after seeing it referred to as such in several British patents. In most cases, the lifter will only be engaged for a limited portion of the opening arc before it is released to snap back down. Again, in most cases, this is accomplished by a secondary part that has been occasionally known as the tooth or other names like that. Unfortunately, the word tooth is so generic that it gets really confusing because you have ratchet teeth on the cylinder, or you may even have ratchet teeth on the lifter itself, like an old Smith & Wesson. So I've actually opted to name it the chock, something that prevents rotation and can be freed to allow rotation. Our Tranter 1879 is also an auto extractor, but thankfully it has a little piece here that we can see from the outside. This lever right here is actually our chock. If I leave it alone and let it spring into that lifter, we can just open her up and she'll extract. If I actually tip it and disengage the chock, we can open her up without extracting. So that's kind of a cool feature. While we're playing with the Tranter 1879, I'd also like to point out that I want to call anything that allows us to open up for loading or unloading a latch. I think latch is fair. This is a latch lever. You might have a latch button, but latch is what I'm going with. And while we're on the topic, I'm also going to call anything that releases the arbor or retains the arbor in the system a catch. So this button right here is the catch. And if I press it, we can free the arbor, which is actually attached to the cylinder in this case. So we get a little 2-for-1 there. A fairly rudimentary catch can be found on our Dutch 1873. It's just a sort of weird angled spring that, if I depress the bulbous bit, allows me to pull the arbor out and therefore would free the cylinder if I went ahead and opened it up from the other side. But you guys get the idea. Now, sometimes components will double as a catch, like in this Bodeo, which uses a patron ejector rod. So we'll pull out our ejector rod, flip over that collar, and if we align it correctly, it will allow us to, you know what, let's get a better look. It will allow us to remove our arbor, which means that our collar for our ejector rod is also simultaneously serving as our catch. Now, of course, there are more ways to load or unload revolvers. This Girard revolver is actually a bottom brake. That's interesting enough, but if we keep on going, we'll find that we also have an external and very interestingly shaped lifter, manually operated lifter, but a lifter nonetheless. This Silver & Fletcher modified Webley has not only an ejector, it also has an extractor. So in the normal sense, we could open up our gate and pull out our little ejector rod, fold it over, and kick out each casing. But this also has a theoretical function with an extractor. The hammer will strike this lever with an extractor blade on the inside. As the cartridges roll over, their rims, see how they have a groove here for them? The rims will catch on that extractor point. And in this alignment, with the hammer slapping down, it should pop them out. Now, unfortunately, it's gotten a little weak over the years, so I haven't quite managed to get this to function correctly. It's also not supposed to be run with ammunition while firing. It's supposed to be used to eject spent casings rather rapidly, kind of like an auto Abity. This British Enfield revolver has a loading gate so that we can load our 6 rounds, but it also has a latch and top brake action with simultaneous extraction off of our extractor star right there. Look at that. The extractor is retained along the arbor, which is still set in between the frame and barrel assembly, never free to the wind like the previous Webleys we saw. So this has 2 systems in one. Frankly, an odd choice, but at least we have the language to describe it. Now, obviously, I could keep showing you strange revolver systems, but thankfully I've already done that in our Revolvers 101 video, where I broke down how to understand the principles of how revolvers work. To some small degree, this episode duplicated some of that effort, but only so far as to define the terms that I'd like to use going forward. Now, of course, these are not set in stone, and if you can think of any revolvers which fundamentally defy these categorizations, please let us know so that I can further improve our lexicon. I'll know we succeeded when people begin to leave comments correcting my old videos with my own ironed out dictionary invented many years later. Special thanks again goes to our Revolver Research Project admin, Alpha Golf, for helping me put together so much documentation that I could use to draw from and proof check my own work. We've also had a number of individual helpers who have their own expertise in one country, like Ludovic or Lars. I want to thank them and any others that have participated, big or small, in this project. It's been a real help. All right, hopefully this was a fun exercise, and more importantly, I really hope it establishes a way for us to be able to compare these systems to each other so there can be a conversation of this versus that like we have with other guns. All right, have a good one. So I went to listen to the podcast with her and GOA to understand the GOA podcast because I hadn't heard it. Mm-hmm. So I'm just sort of listening to it driving around in the car, going between here and the property to do all that work. Mm-hmm. And I realize I'm being talked about in the podcast, but they haven't said my name at all. I'm listening to this. I'm going, okay. So I went to my first gun show and she's like, I was scared witless because this big dude and like 5 other people, just like this guy taps me on the shoulder. I turn around, he's huge because she's very small. Mm-hmm. And I'm 6'1" because she's in the story.
She's 4 something, right?
And she's like, yeah, this big dude is just like, oh, hey, I heard you were down here. It's nice to actually meet you. I'm glad I got to run into you. You know what I mean? And he knew who I was. He knew what I was about. And he's like telling me about, he was telling me something. And all I hear is just like, and I can't remember if she describes it this way, but she basically says the guy's telling her something and all she hears is, ee, because
she's so flustered.
Yeah, she's in her head going, oh my God, because this doesn't happen to her.
Right.
I think the rails that because I don't want to make a whole thing out of the rails. That's just a part of human nature.
Right.
And by the way, I do not look down on people on the rails.
Oh, no. Yeah.
I know people are going to be like, oh, you're complaining. No, I don't fit on them. You can fit on them fine.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I'm jealous. I sincerely wish that I had a 9 to 5 that I felt invested in and could just, like, I'd have so much more free time. It would be way more relaxing. There's nowhere near as much anxiety or toll on my body. That sounds much better. I also wish that I was like 5'7", which I know is weird. But
super weird, yeah.
yeah, I know. But attractiveness is determined by height, according to a lot of people. But I'm going to tell you, the smaller guys can fit in all the cool stuff. I can't drive an old tank. I won't fit in it.
No.
I can't drive a Mazda Miata. You know what I mean? And I've tried. Now, in order to use this pistol, you would have both hammers at full cock. Oh, good Lord, these are stiff, and I am not left-handed. But you would carry it in your left hand for loading and unloading because they put the tab for that on the right. So the idea was take it off your dominant hand, put it in your non-dominant, open her up, and then grab your ammo.